Pavan Sukhdev, welcome to Sinclair Knight Mertz, and thank you for talking to Achieve magazine. You're the leader, the study leader of TEEB, T-E-E-B, the Economics of Ecosystem and Biodiversity. Now that's a very big topic, but you have a very big, impressive resume, which suggests you're just the man for the job. Tell us about the study and how it all came about.
Sure. Well, I think let me first begin with biodiversity, because that's the first stumbling block. Biodiversity is the living fabric of this planet. It's ecosystems, it's species, it's genes. It's the lot on which our life depends and our economy thrives and survives. But a lot of what comes to us from biodiversity comes free, because such is nature. She doesn't send invoices and bills afterwards. And unfortunately, because of that aspect of biodiversity and ecosystem services, as we call it, the services of nature, they tend not to be reflected in economic thinking or in policy decision making. And therein lies the problem. And this is why TEEB was created. Some of you may remember the Stern Review, which came out in 2006. It presented an economic case for why climate change should be reflected not just in terms of risks and uncertainties, but also in terms of economic impacts. And TEEB is really doing the same thing for nature, which is ecosystems and biodiversity. As for me, well, I began as a banker, as a markets person, in fact, as a foreign exchange trader many years ago. I have a background in both science and economics and finance. And I have a passion for nature, and have always had for as long as I can remember, including engaging myself in various NGOs which have been working in the space. And for the last 14 odd years, I've been seriously involved in the economics of nature, why it's important, why people should know about it, and why policymakers should do something about it, and why businesses should recognize it.
Well, you certainly have a great reputation as a financial innovator, but do you believe you can introduce innovation on this scale to business, to introduce business to the concept of global biodiversity?
Well, there's a lot of innovation in nature itself. I mean, there's a lot that comes to us which is innovative. Just imagine the carbon storage that is provided by the world's forests. And just imagine on the flip side, something else which tries to do the same thing, which is carbon capture and storage, which is complex, expensive, risky. The trees just do that on their own. So part of this whole thing is about learning from nature. But I think where we can bring, as in this group of economists and ecologists and biodiversity scientists can bring innovation, is to make more transparent to people what exactly is the role of nature in the economy, why it should be demonstrated as valuable, and in some cases why it should be captured. In other words, why someone should pay for it and someone should receive the value for looking after these assets, these natural assets, which are delivering ecosystem services. What do I mean by ecosystem services? It's things like a forest provides flood prevention and drought control. A forest provides water retention for agriculture around it and provides nutrients. Bees provide pollination. Clean air and fresh water are actually the result of natural processes which happen if we allow nature to proceed. Now, if we destroy it or if we damage it, then we don't get those processes. All of these are vital for the economy. They are vital for our survival, in fact.
So how would you summarize the challenges?
Well, to me, the challenges come in three stages. I think to begin with, we have an understanding, a learning challenge. I said that the word biodiversity is probably the worst way of describing wild nature, because it just is technical, it loses you. It's not something that the average Mr. and Mrs. Smith understand. And that's challenge one, which is the understanding challenge. Challenge two is getting this across into policy, despite the fact that most of what comes from nature is not easily captured in terms of economic value. Today, economics has become the currency of policy. Everything that is suggested cannot simply fly because it's logical, it's commonsensical, or it's got heart. It needs to have economic justification. Otherwise, it tends to find second or third stage in the minds of policymakers. And there's a huge challenge in getting economic estimates for what is not traded in markets. And the reality is that most of what nature provides is not traded in markets.
So let's bring this round to business and identify some of the biodiversity challenges that are relevant to business.
People forget that business provides more than 2/3 of employment, and most of the, more than 70% of the global economy is private sector. And at a time like that, in a world like this, for business not to be involved in anything as significant as valuing nature would be absurd. And therefore TEEB, that is our project on the economics of ecosystems and biodiversity, is actually got a separate publication which is called TEEB for Business. Here we talk about, on the one hand, the risks that are faced by business in case nature's natural resources are lost. On the other, the new opportunities that are coming through to us. And on the third, a methodology for valuing and estimating what is a business's impact on nature. Take a case in point. I mean, the Aral Sea is lost essentially because water was diverted for cotton farming. In China, the construction industry has had a huge impact on China's forests and now on forests around the world, including in Southeast Asia.
Your TEEB study has been underway for some time now. Have you reached some early conclusions? And possibly what's the most compelling argument that you believe is now confronting us?
Well, there are a few that have come through, and it's asking me which are the most compelling arguments. It's like saying which is your favorite child, but I'll try. I think the one that hit us first and hardest is just the sheer scale. I mean, we are talking about here losing forests, for instance, who every year the area of forest loss is a generator of something like $50 billion worth of ecosystem services of value for people. And if you take that in terms of what's the present value of all of that that's been lost, in other words, what's its worth today, we're talking about a couple of $1 trillion, between $2 and $4 trillion worth of natural capital, as we call it, that's being lost every year. Learning number two is that unlike what people keep saying, that biodiversity is the preserve of the rich, and this is an elitist argument, and you're anti-development and you're anti-this, forget that. That's not true. The third thing that we've found is the sheer scale of corporate externalities. In other words, how much do corporates and their emissions, their freshwater usage and their footprint on biodiversity, how much is that? Again, massive. We're talking about something like 2.2 trillion, according to a study that we are collaborating with from TrueCost, of corporate externalities from the world's top 3,000 companies. So, and I think we're still collecting a few more pieces of information. But I'll say this, I think some of the most fascinating things we've learned out here is that there are solutions. If we look at a small country like Costa Rica, for instance, they have set up a system there called Payment for Environmental Services. It's been going on for more than a decade now. And there, they took the view that they were losing forests to pasture because essentially there wasn't any economic reward for keeping forests alive, but there was something like $50 per hectare per year for converting it into pasture for cattle ranching. Well, guess what? They decided to pay their poor farmers, pay the farmers who own this land $50 per hectare per year, prices benchmarked against that. And the net result is that wealth has improved, the quality of soil, the fertility of the soil, freshwater flows from the forest patches has improved. Forest cover has increased in Costa Rica, more than doubled during this period. And we find an economy which is more aware of how to function in harmony with nature, and a people who are richer by more than 4 times per capita GDP and are clearly benefiting from the actions that were taken 10 years ago.
So while the world leaders are trying to find a way to decarbonise the global economy, you're busily working away greening the supply chain, trying to change things from the bottom up.
Absolutely, and I think both are necessary. I mean, if you think back to Copenhagen, many people came away from Copenhagen disappointed, and I confess I was there for 10 days. It left a hole in my heart. But I sat back over Christmas and I said, well, what's the problem? Even if we had the best outcome from Copenhagen, that means, well, 45% cuts by 2020 and 85% cuts by 2050. Great. So we would have achieved what I call a road sign to our safe destination in terms of a climate-safe world. But what's the use of a road sign unless you have the vehicle that gets you there? And that vehicle that you need to get you there is the green economy, is an economy of permanence, is an economy that understands and makes use of natural capital much better than it has ever done before.
I have to admire your timing. On top of the global financial crisis, you're coming along with another message for business saying that they have to value biodiversity as well. How do you make that argument to business in this climate?
Well, I make the argument in very simple language. I put it thus. Firstly, look into the economic crisis. It began with a fuel price hike, which is, again, resource scarcity hitting you. It converted into a food price hike. And at the same time, of course, there was the ecological background of climate risks and making use of biofuel and therefore creating a sort of further cycle of increasing corn prices and so on. There's all kinds of factors at play which led to the economic crisis. And of course, the killer was the financial crisis, which was in many ways very similar to the way we handle fisheries, where the herd mentality of everyone chasing the same common resource pool resulted in effectively a collapse of the financial system. And I keep reminding them, look at how we are operating this global economic model. Isn't there a smarter way of doing it, which recognizes that capital is threefold, is three-dimensional?
All right, well, that's on the government level. But what about business? What can business do to make changes, to align itself with this new paradigm that is biodiversity?
Yeah. We have quite a number of new pieces of research and guidance that are coming through from many countries, be it from European Union, Japan, Australia, Canada. There are a whole host of new pieces of research and guidance that are coming through. And I think companies will find that over the next 3 years, there is enough support to them to do the following things. Work out how to mitigate their impacts on the environment, work out the costing of that mitigation, in other words, how to put a price to the cost of reducing their impacts on the environment, reducing their biodiversity impacts, reducing their carbon emissions. And also give them the opportunity through various business councils and through dialogue with their governments to ask for rule changes. And that is vital, because business on its own, working out of a situation where it does have externalities, it does have external costs to the environment and to the natural world, cannot simply move away from that behavior unless the framework changes. In other words, unless the football field, as I called it, gets leveled. And therefore, business CEOs have to aggressively lobby their governments and aggressively, through their business organizations, lobby the powers that be to make the rule changes so that level playing fields are possible. Once that happens, and I think that is going to be a 3 to 5 year challenge, if it starts now, then business can start recognizing and reflecting the risks, catching the opportunities, disclosing its impacts on the environment, and doing all those things that the TEEB project is suggesting, and which is based very much on the Global Reporting Initiative, the GRI people, or TrueCost, a company that has been doing research in this space, or any of the many people who are involved in this space. Now, it is an evolving space, so I have to admit that not all the answers are readily available for every industry. But I think there's enough there. I think there's enough there which you will get as our report comes out. And we do take pains to document all of this in our report.
Pavan, just before we wrap, you're actually practicing what you preach. You have a personal reforestation program in tropical North Queensland. Give us a snapshot of what you're doing up there in Northern Australia.
Yeah, this is an interesting story, actually. It began in 2000, where I was head of money markets for Asia Pacific for Deutsche Bank, and I used to fly about a lot, and I used to feel terribly guilty about carbon footprint. Now, in those days, unlike now, you couldn't just pull out a form from the seat of the aircraft and fill X number of dollars for Y amounts of carbon. So I thought, well, let's do this the hard way. Let's grow some forests. And I initially thought of doing it in India, and it didn't work out because property rights are not secure. And then I thought of, hey, how about Australia, a place I know well? And we bought some land and we started replanting local rainforests. And then we got friendly with the neighbors, and it became a big project. And it's been wonderful. We've had more than 5 plantings there and some repair work, and now some bush fruit plantings, which is basically local rainforest trees. My most stunning moment there was that after 9 months of the first planting, as I was wandering about the area, we had planted 52 different species, and among those is a tree called the lemon aspen. And on a lemon aspen, I discovered a tiny creature, which I thought was a baby frog. I don't know much about these things. But when I showed it to my friends in the forestry department, they said, no, that's an eastern dwarf tree frog. And that's come back because you've planted its home tree, which is basically the lemon aspen. To me, that taught something, because I'd begun this thing as a carbon project. It was basically offset, right? I'd done a rough back of the envelope calculation for how much tree I have to plant to offset my emissions. And it turned out to be a biodiversity project. And that's the beauty of this whole learning exercise. So that's, I guess, where I come from personally.
That's a great example. You're working away on the micro level as well as tackling all the global challenges. Pavan Sukhdev, thank you for taking time out to talk to Achieve magazine at SKM.
Thank you. It's been great talking to you.